Good evening, everyone, and welcome back. Tonight, I have something truly special prepared for you, a carefully gathered collection of real camping stories, shared by real people, who experienced things they never expected and could never quite forget. So go ahead and settle in. Pull your blanket a little tighter. Maybe dim the lights just a touch. Because tonight, the darkness gets to do the talking. Before we begin, I just want to say, if you are here for the very first time, welcome to this channel. We are so glad you found us. Please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and join our community of listeners who gather here every night for stories just like these. And make sure you tap that notification bell so you never miss a single one. Now then, let us begin. Story 1, The Moonlit Lake. Our first story tonight comes not from my own experience, but from someone very close to my heart, a dear, trusted friend of mine. I am sharing it with her full blessing, and I want to say from the start that even after hearing it, even after knowing how it ends, it still gives me a chill every single time I think about it. This happened at the very beginning of summer. The air was still carrying that soft, promising freshness that only exists in those first true warm days of the year, before the heat becomes heavy, before the novelty of long evenings wears off. My friend and her husband Jay had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. It was something they both needed deeply. Life had been busy, relentless even, and this camping trip was their way of breathing again. They were heading to her absolute favorite place in the entire world. Not a fancy campground with electricity hookups or a camp store selling overpriced firewood. Not anywhere close to a town with a coffee shop on the corner or a gas station just down the road. This was a true, honest-to-goodness wilderness campground. The kind that swallows you whole the moment you turn off the main road. There was no cell service out there, not even enough for an emergency call. No restaurants, no convenience stores, nothing that reminded you the modern world existed at all. What it did have, though, was breathtaking. Tucked deep inside the forest was a crystal-clear lake, the kind of lake that looks almost too perfect to be real, like something painted onto a canvas. The water was so clean and pure you could see straight to the sandy bottom even in the middle. There were hiking trails that wound through the trees and seemed to disappear into mystery the further you followed them. A gentle river ran through part of the property, perfect for canoeing and fishing on a lazy afternoon. And in almost every direction you looked, there were miles and miles of truly untouched wilderness, wild and ancient and completely unbothered by human hands. This trip was meant to be something special between the two of them. A reset. A reunion with nature and with each other. But they got off to a slightly later start than planned, because Jay had to go into work that Saturday morning. So by the time they finally pulled into the campground, the afternoon was already tipping toward evening. And what they found when they arrived both surprised and quietly thrilled them. The campground was nearly deserted. In fact, as far as they could tell, they were the only people there. Not another car in sight. Not a single tent already pitched. Just them, the trees, the birds settling in for the night, and all that glorious, untouched space. They set up their tent with ease, made their way down one of the hiking trails, and had a wonderful picnic near a beautiful waterfall that sent mist floating through the air like a whisper. By the time evening rolled around, they were both pleasantly exhausted, the good kind of tired that comes from using your body the way it was meant to be used. They built a campfire back at the site, opened a bottle of wine, and sat together watching fireflies blinking in and out of the darkness between the trees like tiny floating stars. The moon that night was extraordinary, so full and so bright that the trails were completely lit without a single flashlight needed. The whole world felt luminous and soft and quiet and right. That was when my friend had what she, at the time, considered to be a perfectly brilliant idea. She wanted to go for a swim in the lake. A moonlit, skinny-dipping swim. And before you judge her, please understand, this was not unusual for her. She had done it before, right here at this very spot, more than once. The water was clean and cold, and after a full day of hiking through the summer heat, she felt grimy and sweaty and desperately ready for that water. It made complete, natural sense to her. Jay, however, was a different story. He had already had quite a bit of the wine and was completely wiped out from the combined weight of work and a full day of hiking. All he wanted, all he was capable of wanting at that moment, was to crawl into the tent and close his eyes. He was done for the night, lovingly, completely done. Now, here is the part she keeps coming back to. Because they were truly alone out there, not just relatively alone, but completely, verifiably alone, she reasoned that a quick swim was perfectly harmless. She said it plainly, if even one other campsite had been occupied that evening, she would never have considered it. Not even for a second. It would have been, in her own words, absolute lunacy. But the campground felt utterly deserted in every direction. The silence was total. The darkness between the trees felt uncrowded and safe. And so, a kind of quiet bravery settled over her, the way it sometimes does when you feel certain no one is watching. Jay crawled into the tent to rest. My friend gathered her things, a beach bag with biodegradable shampoo, soap, a clean change of clothes, and a towel, and set off down the moonlit trail toward the lake. The path was beautiful in that silver light. The trees cast long, gentle shadows. The sound of her footsteps was soft against the earth. And then, at roughly the halfway point of the trail, she felt it. She described it as a creeping, low-grade sensation that moved through her chest, not pain, not quite fear, but something instinctive and animal. A quiet alarm that her body registered before her mind could put any words to it. Nothing had happened. There was no sound, no movement, no visible cause. But something in the most primal part of her said, quietly and clearly, something is off. She ignored it. At the lake, she undressed and placed her clothes carefully on the thick, exposed roots of a massive old pine tree at the water's edge. The lake was exactly as she had hoped, calm, glassy, reflecting the full moon in a single, unbroken shimmer of white light across the dark water. She slipped in and let the cold embrace her. She bathed, floated on her back, swam slowly back and forth in long, lazy strokes, feeling the tension of the week dissolve out of her muscles and drift away into the water. She stayed in far longer than she planned, nearly a full hour. Completely relaxed. Completely at peace with the universe and the night and the cool, clean world around her. When she finally climbed out, the night air bit at her damp skin. She stood on the shore, drying off slowly, pulling on her clean clothes. And then, gradually, undeniably, that feeling returned. The one from the trail. Only this time it was stronger. She looked up toward the tree line along the natural slope that rose up from the far side of the lake. The lake sat in a kind of wide natural bowl, surrounded by dense forest in a gradual hillside, elevated enough that someone standing at the top could easily look straight down at the shore below, completely hidden within the shadow of the trees. Her heart nearly stopped. A person stepped forward out of the darkness. She could not see a face. She could only see the silhouette, tall and still against the pale, moonlit sky behind it. For a split second, her mind grasped for the most comforting explanation available. Jay. Maybe he had woken up. Maybe he had changed his mind and come to find her. Maybe, somehow, he had decided to surprise her. Holding on to that hope, she laughed nervously and called out, something light, something casual. Sorry, you missed a great swim. She kept talking while she finished getting dressed, fully expecting to hear his voice come back to her. A joke, a complaint about the cold, anything. But the figure said nothing. It did not move toward her. It did not call back. It simply stood there. Watching. Silent. Still. As she finished pulling on her clothes and picked up her bag, the figure took a single, quiet step backward and slipped back into the trees as silently as smoke, as though it had never been there at all. And that was when the truth crashed over her like ice water. That was not Jay. She did not stop to think. She did not hesitate or look back to be sure. Her body simply moved, and she ran. She tore back down the moonlit trail toward camp, her heart hammering so hard against her ribs she genuinely thought she might black out. At some point along the way, she believed she heard voices behind her. More than one. But the fear consuming her made it impossible to know whether the sound was real or simply her terrified imagination filling in the darkness with noise. She reached the campsite breathless and shaking so hard she could barely stand. Jay was sound asleep, completely undisturbed, completely unaware. She tried desperately to wake him, shaking him, whispering urgently, wanting nothing more than to pack everything into the car and leave that moment. But he was so deeply exhausted, so completely under, that he could not fully rouse himself no matter how hard she tried. She did not sleep at all that night. Every snapping twig, every soft rustle in the brush around the campsite sent her sitting bolt upright with her heart hammering all over again. She lay in the darkness replaying the image of that silent, unmoving figure in the trees, asking herself the same questions over and over. How long had he been standing there watching her? Had he followed her from the campsite, or had he been at the lake the entire time, waiting? In the morning, when Jay finally woke up and made coffee and she told him everything, the full, terrifying sequence of events, he went pale. And then he went furious. Furious and terrified and deeply shaken for her. Together, they hiked back down the trail to the lake. To the spot where she had seen the figure standing. Where the tree line met the slope. They found footprints. 2 distinct sets. There had been 2 of them up there. Watching her in the dark. That was one of the most profoundly terrifying experiences of her life. And even now, even with time and distance between her and that night, the thought of how completely vulnerable she was, alone, undressed, in the water, utterly unaware, still makes her shudder from the inside out. So to whoever you were out there in those woods that night, watching from the shadows, please, let's not meet. And for what it is worth, she has never taken another moonlit swim alone again. Not once. If you are enjoying tonight's stories so far, please give this video a like, it helps so many more listeners find us. And if you have ever had a similar experience while camping or out in nature, I want to hear about it. Drop your story in the comments below. This community is full of kind, thoughtful people, and your experience matters. Story 2, The Slashed Tents. This next story took place a few years ago, when our storyteller was just 13 years old. And it is, without question, the reason they no longer camp without a very large group of people around them. Let them tell it in their own words. At 13, I was what most people would call a pretty social kid. I had a tight, close group of friends, we were basically inseparable. There was Rose, Lynn, Noah, and Zach. My inner circle. My people. Together, we were always doing something, always planning something, always looking for the next adventure. Road trips with parents who probably trusted us just a little bit too much. Beach days. Sleepovers that lasted until someone's mom called the third time. And especially camping. Camping was one of our favorite things. Noah's family was well off, which meant we had access to gear and space and resources that made our adventures easier than most kids our age. And most of our parents were pretty relaxed and easygoing, which meant we were given a level of freedom that, looking back now, was perhaps a little more than was wise. The summer before 8th grade, we organized a camping trip, 7 of us in total. There was Lynn's older sister Margot, who was 17. And Zach's older brother Todd, also 17. Having 2 older teenagers along made everyone feel reassured. Safe. Like a buffer against anything going wrong. What could possibly happen with 2 practically adults looking out for us? We chose a forested area about 20 miles from Noah's house. It was isolated. His neighborhood was the nearest anything resembling civilization, and once you drove far enough in through the trees, there was no cell service at all. Not one bar. No emergency calls. Nothing. At the time, that felt exciting, like the realness of a proper adventure. We arrived without any issue, set up camp efficiently. Girls in one tent, boys in the other. The two tents sat just a few feet apart with the fire pit roughly 20 feet away. Looking back now, the reality of 7 teenagers, 2 of them only 17, alone in the woods with no phone service, makes my stomach tighten. But at the time, nobody questioned it. The area had no history of crime or dangerous wildlife encounters. It felt fine. It felt like just camping. The first day was exactly what you would hope for. We swam in the nearby lake, dried off in the warmth of the afternoon sun, cooked dinner over the campfire, and made s'mores until we ran out of marshmallows. We laughed and joked long after dark. Eventually, Lynn and Margot said they were exhausted and headed to the girls' tent for the night. That left Todd, Rose, Zach, Noah, and me sitting around the dying fire, telling ridiculous scary stories, laughing at each other, soaking in that beautiful, careless feeling that only belongs to childhood, that specific kind of joy that comes from believing wholeheartedly that nothing bad can ever truly happen to you. That illusion did not last long. Margot stepped suddenly out of the darkness, clearly annoyed and confused. She told us to stop messing with her tent. We all stared at her. Not a single one of us had moved from the fire. Margot explained that someone had been touching the outside of the tent, dragging something along the fabric, pressing against it from outside. She said it felt far too deliberate and purposeful to be wind or the branch of a tree. Todd laughed it off, suggesting it was probably just something from the trees nearby. We all laughed too, because it was easier. But something about the expression on Margot's face stayed with me even then. There was a seriousness beneath the annoyance that I could not dismiss. Rose and I decided to go to bed as well. Inside the tent, Lynn was already deeply asleep. I settled closest to the entrance, Rose beside me, Margot at the far end next to Lynn. I fell asleep almost immediately. That did not last. I jolted awake. Heart already pounding, no idea why. I checked my phone, 2:15 in the morning. The forest outside was completely, unnaturally silent. And then I heard it. A soft, deliberate tapping against the outside of the tent fabric. Tap. 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 And then, after a pause, a low, muffled giggle. Deep-toned. Nothing like any of the boys in our group. I went absolutely rigid. Barely breathing. Staring at the thin nylon wall between me and whatever was outside. The tapping continued. Another quiet laugh followed. I lay there paralyzed, counting the seconds until it finally stopped. I told myself it was nothing. Exhaustion. A branch. One of the boys trying to scare us. I did not wake anyone up. I did not want to seem foolish. So I talked myself down and eventually fell back asleep. At dawn, Rose shook me awake. Everyone was restless and the morning air felt off somehow, heavy in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. We decided to go hiking before the heat of the day set in, and since we were staying another night, we split into 2 groups so the campsite would never be completely unattended. Margot, Lynn, Rose, and I went out hiking for a few hours. When we returned, the campsite was empty. The boys were nowhere. Margot assumed they had gone to the lake and set off with Lynn to find them. Rose and I headed toward the tents. That is when I screamed. Both tents were slashed open. Not torn. Not ripped apart by an animal digging for food. Slashed. The cuts were small, precise, and controlled, like someone had taken deliberate, careful time to make them. The tent material was thick and durable. This was not an accident. This was not wildlife. Whoever had done this had come prepared, with a knife, and had used it with intention. When the others came running back, panic set in immediately and completely. The decision was unanimous without even needing a vote. We needed to leave. Right now. Then Todd delivered the news that changed everything. His tires had been slashed. Let that sink in for a moment. No cell service. One car disabled. And someone had clearly been watching us long enough to know which car was ours, long enough to come prepared, long enough to have been there throughout the night. Margot checked her car. Her tires were untouched. She made the decision quickly. She would take Noah and Lynn back to Noah's house to call the police and their parents, then return for the rest of us. There simply was not enough room with all the gear packed in. So that left 4 of us, Zach, Todd, Rose, and me. None of us wanted to stay anywhere near that campsite for a single second longer than necessary, so we started hiking toward the main road to meet Margot partway. About 30 minutes into the walk, my phone died. Zach and Rose had no signal, but their phones were working enough to track time. As we walked, I started hearing branches snapping behind us. Heavy, rhythmic snapping, the kind that does not come from animals, the kind that moves at a pace matching your own. I told Todd. He went immediately tense. He kept glancing back over his shoulder, and then, without ceremony, gave one sharp command, "Run." I turned my head just once before my legs took over. 3 hooded figures were sprinting toward us through the trees. All of them enormous, easily 6 feet tall, well over 200 pounds. They wore dark hoodies and ski masks despite the broad daylight. You could not see a single feature of their faces. 2 of them were holding knives. I have never run like that in my life. Before or since. We ran with every ounce of everything we had. Eventually, the footsteps behind us stopped. They either gave up or decided we were not worth the continued effort. We did not slow down until we reached the main road. Margot eventually came back for us. We told the police everything, every detail, every moment. They searched the woods thoroughly. They found nothing. Only the shredded remains of our tents. I have thought many times since then about what would have happened if Todd had not been paying attention. If he had not heard those branches. If he had hesitated even 10 seconds longer before giving the order to run. We were children. We would not have stood a chance against 3 large adults with knives in the middle of a forest with no cell service. We were so unbelievably lucky. Story 3, The Tornado and the Middle Door. This next story is one I find genuinely extraordinary, because it is not just about danger. It is about instinct. About the quiet, invisible force that sometimes moves through us when something is very, very wrong. This happened when our storyteller was working as a camp counselor in Wisconsin during what turned out to be one of the worst tornado seasons the area had experienced in years. Storm warnings were a constant backdrop to that entire summer. The skies seemed to have a short, unpredictable temper, bright and blue in the morning, then twisting into a sickly greenish color in a matter of minutes by mid-afternoon. The air would go completely dead still in that way that makes the back of your neck prickle, and then the weather radio would crackle to life again. Because of this relentless unpredictability, on the very first night with her new group of campers, she gave them what she admits probably sounded like an overly dramatic safety speech. She told them to sleep with their shoes placed directly beside their beds and to keep their jacket hanging on the corner of their bunk. She explained clearly, directly, firmly, that if the tornado sirens went off in the middle of the night, there would be absolutely no time to search for anything. None. They would need to be awake, dressed, and moving toward the storm shelter immediately. They nodded. Some of them looked nervous. This was their first time away from home, their first time sleeping in a wooden cabin deep in the middle of the woods at night. The cabin itself was long and divided by a wall running straight down the center. She and her group stayed on one side. Another counselor and her group stayed on the other. There was a connecting door built into that dividing wall, though normally everyone used their own exterior door to come and go. That night, the forest outside was alive with the grinding sound of cicadas and the low, rolling rumble of distant thunder moving through the hills. Storms had passed through earlier in the evening, but things had quieted down by bedtime. Still, the air felt tense in a way that was hard to explain. She went to sleep with her own shoes lined up neatly beside her bed, exactly as she had told the children to do. Somewhere in the deep middle of the night, she jolted awake. She did not know what had woken her. The cabin was completely dark. Completely still. There was no rain hitting the roof, no wind in the trees. There was only a silence so heavy and so complete it felt almost physical, a held breath, a pause before something enormous. And then she heard it. Faint. Distant. Floating through the trees from somewhere beyond. Tornado sirens. For one disoriented half-second she wondered if she was dreaming. But then that feeling struck her, that full body, electric wave of instinctive alarm. Every single hair on her arms rose. Her heart began hammering so loudly she could feel it in her ears and in her throat. She sat up in the dark, fully awake, completely alert, and without stopping to think for even a fraction of a second, she opened her mouth and yelled at the top of her voice. "Wake up and put your shoes on right now." The children exploded awake. She was shouting for jackets, shouting for shoes, shouting at them to move, 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 and they scrambled exactly as they had been told. Velcro tearing. Zippers yanking. Feet hitting the wooden floor hard. And then she did something she still cannot fully explain. Instead of taking them through their normal exterior door, the one that opened out onto the field leading directly toward the storm shelter, she shoved open the connecting door in the middle wall and pushed them through to the other side of the cabin. She shouted at them to keep moving and not stop. The other counselor was already awake, her face tight with fear. One look at the expression coming through that middle door was all it took. She immediately began guiding her own campers. Together, both groups poured out the far side of the cabin and sprinted across the clearing toward the shelter. The wind had picked up furiously. The trees around the clearing were whipping and crashing. Lightning flickered constantly across the sky. By the time they reached the shelter, the sirens were at full volume, screaming through the night. Inside, the children huddled together on the cold concrete floor. Some were crying. Some were shaking. Many of them reached for each other or for the arms of their counselors while the storm roared overhead like a freight train tearing through the forest at full speed. The shelter walls vibrated. Debris struck the roof. The waiting felt like it lasted forever. Eventually, the all-clear sounded. When they finally walked back toward the cabin with flashlights cutting through the rain-soaked darkness, the air smelled heavily of mud and broken wood. They came around the bend in the path. And stopped. A massive tree had come down directly onto their side of the cabin. It had punched straight through the roof and collapsed into the interior, directly onto the area where the children's bunks had been. Half the cabin was gone. Crushed inward. Broken beams and splintered wood and crumpled roof panels lying in the exact place where her campers had been sleeping minutes before. No one spoke. Not a single voice. They all just stood there in the rain, staring. If she had taken them through the normal door, they would have walked directly beneath that tree as it fell. If she had hesitated even a few seconds longer getting them up and moving, they would have still been in their bunks. If she had brushed off that terrible, inexplicable feeling and gone back to sleep, everything would have been different. To this day, she does not know what made her push them through that middle door. She only knows that something inside her said, "Go now, go this way, do not wait." And because she listened to that voice, every single one of those children went home alive. If a story like that moves you, if you have ever had a moment where your gut told you something before your mind caught up, please share it in the comments below. I genuinely believe these instincts exist for a reason. And I would love to hear your experiences. Story 4, The Drums in the Dark. Our next story comes from someone who went camping with a mixed group, a close childhood friend, some mutual acquaintances, and an older guy they all trusted like a big brother. The kind of person who always seems to have everything handled. The responsible one. He invited the group on a camping trip with some of his longtime friends, men who knew him well but who were complete strangers to our storyteller and her childhood friend. Still, because they trusted him, they agreed and went. 2 cars, a winding drive that took them further and further from the city, roads that deteriorated the deeper they went, cracked, uneven, at one point barely roads at all. At one stretch, the car they were riding in actually got stuck in a dip in the road. Everyone piled out to push while the tires spun uselessly in the mud. It felt like the land itself was trying to discourage them. But eventually they made it through the worst of it and reached the woods. And whatever frustration the journey had caused melted away the moment they arrived. The spot they had chosen sat beside a lake that looked completely untouched, like no human being had stood on its shore in years. The water's surface was perfectly still. The sky above was so clear and so free of light pollution that the stars were brighter than anything our storyteller had ever seen in her life. She said honestly, it looked almost fake. Like a painted backdrop. They set up their tents, settled in, and the group fell into easy, comfortable conversation. Hours drifted by naturally. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, most of the group began to wind down, scrolling phones, zoning out, letting the night get quiet around them. That was when our storyteller, her childhood friend, one of the other guys, and their older brother figure decided to play a game. Hiding behind trees and tents. Jumping out to scare each other. Silly, harmless fun at 3 in the morning. But then something subtle and strange began to happen. The laughter got bigger than it should have. More intense than the situation warranted. Uncontrollable, almost hysterical laughter that had no real source, nothing was that funny, and yet none of them could stop. One of the guys sitting nearby looked over and asked, genuinely confused, whether they were drunk. None of them had touched a drop of alcohol all night. They were completely sober. And yet the laughter felt like something external, something being pushed through them rather than coming from within. And then it simply stopped. All at once. Like someone turned off a switch. In the silence that followed, they heard it. From somewhere deep inside the trees, a sound began drifting in. Soft at first, barely there. A repetitive, rhythmic pattern. Drumming. Then a second sound joined it, a flute. Together they formed something that sounded ancient and intentional. Not modern. Not a phone speaker or a Bluetooth device. This was something that sounded like ritual music, like ceremony, like a procession from another era entirely. Everyone at the campsite went completely still. All conversation stopped. No one breathed loudly. Every face turned toward the darkness of the tree-line. The music moved. Not closer, but around them. Circling. You could feel the direction shifting the way you feel where thunder is coming from, the way your ear tracks sound through space. The drums and the flute wove around the campsite in a wide, slow ring, passing from one patch of darkness to another, as though someone or several people were walking a deliberate circle around their tents in the night. It went on long enough that every single person present fully understood this was not a prank. The men from the other car did not move. No one whispered. No one dared to shine a light into the trees. They all simply sat there, sharing that silent, collective look, the one that passes between people when they are all frightened in exactly the same way at exactly the same moment. And then it stopped. Not gradually. Not fading away. It simply ceased to exist. No one slept. They sat awake until daylight, watching the tree-line and waiting. Has anything like this ever happened to you? Because I cannot imagine hearing something like that, deep in the woods, in the middle of the night, with nowhere to go and no explanation in the world that would make it feel okay. Story 5, The Girl at the Bathroom. This next story arrives from Sweden, specifically from Torsby, in Värmland, and it happened just a short time ago. Our storyteller has always had a sense of the spiritual, an openness to what lies beyond the visible world. But what happened during these nights at a campground with her theater group was something that went far beyond belief. It crossed into something she and her friend both saw with their own eyes. They had cabins at the campground and had developed a nightly habit after performances, wandering the grounds, talking to whoever they came across, staying open to connection. There was a public bathroom near the camping area with a small playground beside it, including a seesaw. That spot became the center of everything. Night 1, around 11 in the evening, they first spotted her. A girl, approximately 14 years old, in pajama pants and a black hoodie, walking toward the public bathroom. They noticed her the way you notice anyone when you are out walking and looking for friendly faces to talk to. She went into the bathroom. They wandered over to the nearby playground and sat on the seesaw. Our storyteller glanced at the bathroom door. It had a frosted window, not perfectly clear, but enough to make out shapes and shadows. And she saw the girl's silhouette inside. Standing completely still. Facing the mirror. At first it was merely odd. But the minutes passed and the shape did not move. No shifting weight from foot to foot. No fixing hair. No ordinary bathroom movements. Just stillness. Complete, unexplained stillness. They moved the seesaw closer for a better view. Nothing changed. The figure remained unmoving. Then they pushed the seesaw back into place and began swinging again. And the moment they started moving, the bathroom door opened. The girl walked out, same hoodie, same pajama pants, and headed back the way she had come. They did not see where she went. Later that same night, they spotted her again at an outdoor chessboard. Same outfit. Walking the same path, this time heading toward the forest. Her friend called out a greeting. The girl did not respond, did not even glance at them, and continued walking into the trees. Night 2, around 11 again, they found themselves at the seesaw. The campground was quiet. No one else around. And then there she was again. This time without the hoodie. They could see her more clearly now, dark blonde hair, medium length, slightly curly. They greeted her again, offered her some of the candy they were sharing. She looked at them with a strange, knowing smirk, not unkind, but laced with something unreadable, and politely declined. Then she walked into the bathroom. And did not come out. A long stretch of time passed. They walked around the entire building. No other exit. No sign of her. They circled back to the front and both looked through the frosted window. They both saw the same thing. Her hair. The medium length, slightly curly blonde hair. She was inside. Standing again. Facing the mirror. They moved the seesaw aside so they could both see clearly through the window at the same time, wanting to be certain they were not imagining it. They watched together. Then the door handle moved. It pressed down. The door opened. And out walked an old woman. Short, slightly hunched, with dark brown hair cut short. She did not look at them. She walked away in the opposite direction the girl had originally come from. They stood frozen. Not frightened yet, their brains simply could not process what their eyes had just witnessed. They went inside the bathroom. It was empty. No other exit. No other door. No window large enough to matter. Just an empty room. They sat back on the seesaw, trying to find a rational explanation. Then a man walked out of one of the toilet stalls nearby, silently, without a sound of a door or a flush preceding it. A few minutes later, the moment they stood up from the seesaw. Another man walked out of a different stall. Same silence. Same precise timing. Everything felt synchronized. Everything felt as though something was watching and responding, reacting to their movements like a mirror that is a little too aware of its own reflection. They went to find their friend's mother, who has had paranormal experiences of her own. But when they reached the cabins, there was a scene underway, shouting, crying, people arguing in the space outside one of the cabins. The chaos felt surreal and impenetrable. They stepped back, waited, and eventually found her alone inside. She told them quietly that they had made themselves open by wondering and seeking contact. And that perhaps something had noticed. Perhaps it wanted to respond. Our storyteller says that second night broke something in her. She felt helpless and on the verge of tears without fully understanding why. She and her friend have turned every possible theory over in their minds: a spirit caught in a loop, an energy echo, a presence tied to the bathroom or the playground, something changing form, something that noticed two young women who were a little too open on too many nights in a row. She still does not know what they saw. She only knows they both saw the same thing. And that it was real. Like this video if any of these stories have reached something deep inside you tonight. And share it with a friend who loves a good, genuine, spine-tingling story. These experiences deserve to be heard. Story 6, The Arizona Mountain Night. Our next couple had never camped before. Not once. They were on a road trip out west, the kind of big, romantic adventure you plan and dream about, and they decided this was the trip where they would finally do it. Pitch a tent. Sleep under the stars. The whole experience. She had chosen what looked on the map like the perfect spot, high up on a mountain in Arizona, looking out over a sweeping stretch of forest and desert far below. The campsite sat uncomfortably close to a cliff edge and was so remote it required nearly 20 miles of winding gravel road to reach. When they arrived, the place had an almost otherworldly quality to it. The wind was already strong and insistent, dark clouds were building over the mountains, and yet the view was genuinely, staggeringly beautiful. They set up their tent, took a short hike, took photos of the landscape below, and tried to settle in. They noticed a cluster of tents and a few cars grouped nearby, and went to introduce themselves. They had heard rumors of a bad storm coming in that night and wanted some reassurance. The 4 local Arizona guys they spoke with were relaxed, almost amused. The storms, they said, never got that bad up here. That was all the encouragement the couple needed. Later, passing a woman with her dogs and an older companion, they exchanged friendly smiles and kept walking. By the time the sun dipped below the mountains, they were back at their tent. 7 or so people remained at the campsite that night, everyone having decided to ride out whatever the sky had planned. The stars were invisible. Only thick storm clouds above them. The wind snapped and groaned against the tent fabric. Eventually they drifted off. At 10:30 p.m., a crack of thunder tore her awake. Heart already racing. Flash floods were a real danger out there, and the proximity to the cliff edge felt suddenly much more threatening than it had in daylight. She told herself she was overreacting. She went back to sleep. At midnight, she woke again. This time it was not thunder. Something heavy struck the side of their tent. Not once, repeatedly. A striking impact, then a slow dragging sound downward. Over and over. The darkness inside the tent was total. She could not see her own hands. The sound continued, steady and deliberate, and her chest tightened with a rising panic she was fighting to keep under control. Then she heard footsteps. Right outside. Slow and steady, moving along the side of the tent. She froze. One thought crystallized in her mind with absolute clarity: this is how we die. Then, from the opposite side of the tent, came a sound that hit her harder than any of the rest, a deep, slow, exhausted sigh. Close. Right outside the fabric. Certain it was a bear, she reached for her husband's hand in the darkness and squeezed it repeatedly, desperately trying to communicate without making a sound. Instead, he woke up groggy and muttered aloud, "What's wrong? Why are you squeezing my hand?" The footsteps stopped instantly. After a long, trembling silence, she whispered everything to him. They lay there telling themselves it was an animal passing through camp. Eventually they reasoned the repeated impacts against the tent were pine cones or branches falling from the snow-laden trees above, because yes, it was snowing in Arizona, heavily enough to build thick sheets of ice on the branches overhead. And then the tent on her husband's side collapsed inward. Something pressing the fabric down onto his head. He whispered that it felt like something pushing deliberately. And then that familiar sliding sound again. He pushed back from inside and the heavy weight slid away. They finally understood: ice. Heavy accumulations of ice were building up on the branches above and crashing down onto the tent. He pushed the built-up ice off the tent walls from inside until it slid clear. Relieved, shaken, but relieved, they decided to keep a small light on and wait for morning. Things finally felt manageable. And then, not 30 minutes later, from somewhere in the pitch-black forest around them, a woman screamed. Not an angry scream. A raw, terrified, desperate scream. The word that floated toward them sounded like help. Then it came again, the word no, over and over, followed by the sound of a car engine revving and tearing away into the darkness at speed. The silence that followed was absolute. She started crying. Her hands were shaking. It did not sound like the woman was inside that car. It sounded like she was screaming after it. Like she had been left behind. They made the decision without discussion. They were leaving. Right now. They grabbed their essential belongings, pressed close to each other, and moved carefully back to the car in the dark, keeping the headlights off. While her husband went back for the tent, she started the engine and called 911. She described everything: the location, the sounds, the timeline. The dispatcher told them someone would be sent, but warned it would take over an hour. They were deep in the backcountry and the storm had turned the roads to mud. By 3:30 in the morning, they were driving out. As they passed through the campsite, her husband noticed something that neither of them has been able to forget. The 4 Arizona men they had spoken to earlier, the relaxed, experienced, amused by novice campers locals, were gone. Every single car had vanished. But their tents were still standing exactly where they had been pitched. Something had frightened those men badly enough to leave their tents behind and drive away in the dark. It was not until they were already on the road that the full weight of a thought landed on her. Whatever had been walking slowly next to their tent at midnight, the slow footsteps, the deep sigh, might not have been an animal at all. She followed up with the police department a few days later. Officers had searched the area for several hours and spoken with the few people who had remained. They found nothing. No one. No explanation. She says she hopes everyone made it out safely. And that she hopes to never find out what was truly happening on that mountain that night. Story 7, The Figure at the Tent. This story takes us to 2012, to a summer camping trip with a Boy Scout troop. Our storyteller was 15 years old. Camping was routine for his troop, they went out almost every month. But this particular weekend felt different from the moment they arrived. The forested area they had chosen was unusually isolated. Tall grass surrounded the campsite on all sides. The trees beyond the firelight grew thick and close together. And for the entire weekend, not a single other camper appeared. No cars came or went. No voices carried from any direction. The woods seemed to have swallowed them entirely. Because they had the place to themselves, Saturday night brought a large campfire. Later than usual, everyone gathered around it, the flames throwing tall dancing shadows across the ring of tents. Eventually the fire burned down to glowing orange embers and the adults called it time to put the fire out and turn in. He had his own tent that weekend, something he normally loved. Camping usually gave him excellent sleep, the deep, full-body exhaustion of a day spent hiking and being outdoors. But that night, sleep would not come. The forest felt unusually loud, though nothing specific was wrong. Crickets. Distant owls. The soft whisper of wind through grass pressing against the nylon walls of the tents around him. And then he heard footsteps. moving around the outside edge of the cluster of tents. Slow. Deliberate. Circling the perimeter. He lay absolutely still with his breath held, tracking the sound as it stopped, just a few feet from the tent nearest his. After a long pause, the footsteps drifted back toward the trees. He told himself it was one of the adult leaders doing a late-night walkthrough, a reasonable, comforting explanation. He leaned toward the mesh window of his tent and looked out. The campsite was calm. No flashlights. No movement. Just dark shapes and the pale outlines of tents in the moonlight. Eventually he fell asleep. He does not know how much time passed before the footsteps returned. But when they did, they were closer. More purposeful. Following the exact same circular path as before, but tighter. His heart began to pound as he tracked the sound, waiting for it to fade again the way it had before. But it did not fade. It stopped. Right outside the same tent as before. Something made him look through the mesh. A figure stood just outside the tent. Tall. Black. Completely still. Far too large to be any of the boys in the troop. No flashlight. No ranger gear. No identifying details of any kind. Just a solid, barely moving shape in the darkness. The figure reached out. A hand, slowly, with careful deliberation, grasped the zipper of the tent and began to pull it open. Inch by inch. The sound of each metal tooth separating felt impossibly loud in the total silence of the forest. The figure leaned forward. Its head dipped toward the opening. From inside the tent, a blood-curdling scream shattered the night. Everything erupted simultaneously. Tents flew open. Flashlights blazed. Voices shouted in pure, raw panic. The figure jerked backward and then sprinted, fast and low, directly toward the tree line, vanishing into the forest within seconds as though it had never existed. The boys in the tent were hysterical. Others came out admitting they had heard the footsteps all night. The figure had been dressed in dark clothing. No one had gotten a clear look at a face. The adults moved every single child to their section of the campsite and took turns staying awake on watch until sunrise. The moment the sun was fully up, they packed and left without lingering. The ranger was notified. The local sheriff was called. As far as anyone knows, no one was ever identified or caught. He says to this day, he cannot hear the sound of footsteps outside a tent at night without going straight back to that moment. And to whoever was out there in those woods that night, stalking a group of sleeping children, you are a deeply unsettling person. And let us absolutely, unequivocally never meet. Story 8, The Black Truck with No Lights. This next story comes from a group of college friends who discovered, while camping in the remote backcountry of Spruce Run State Forest, that being followed is terrifying enough. But being followed and not knowing by whom, or why, or what they intended, that is something else entirely. 5 of them had reserved a campsite far out on a narrow dirt spur road that branched off an already remote forest road, barely wide enough for one vehicle, ending abruptly in a small clearing. Beyond that clearing, nothing but dense woods falling away into darkness. They spent most of the day hiking in with their gear, climbing steadily as the trees grew thicker and the air cooler and the sounds of the world below fell away. By the time they reached the site, something had shifted. The woods were quieter than expected. There was a particular quality to the silence. They set up camp, ate dinner by the fire, and turned in for the night. That was when they discovered their friend's catastrophic snoring problem, violent, chainsaw-level snoring that made sleep for everyone else completely impossible. After 30 minutes of lying in the dark staring upward, the rest of them gave up and crawled outside. One of the group had a late-night radio show that ran from midnight to 2 in the morning. Since sleep was no longer an option, they walked up toward the main forest road where the phone signal was marginally better and listened to the broadcast through a phone speaker, talking quietly in the moonlit dark. That was when the truck appeared. It emerged from the trees silently, rolling down the forest road with no headlights on. A large, black pickup truck, matte finish, no markings, no plates they could read, windows completely dark. Moving slowly. Deliberately slowly. It passed them close enough that they could smell dust and old engine oil. And yet they could see nothing inside. No face. No movement. No ranger insignia. None of them spoke. They just watched it disappear around the bend. They tried to shake it off. Ranger. Maintenance worker. Someone who forgot their lights. But the woods felt different after that. Changed in a way that was hard to name. About 40 minutes later they began heading back to camp. One of the women stepped off the path briefly while our storyteller climbed into the tent they shared and settled in. A few minutes later she heard quick footsteps through dry leaves, her friend, moving fast, coming from the right. At that exact same moment, the sound of tires on dirt. She sat up and looked through the mesh window. Her friend sprinted into view, her face pale and wide-eyed, and dove behind the tent. And the black truck rolled silently into their campsite. It stopped less than 20 feet from the tent. The engine cut off. The silence was immediate and absolute and far worse than any sound. Their snoring friend slept on, completely unaware. She had a small knife in her tent. She knew the others had one each as well. That was the entirety of their protection. The truck sat there. No doors opened. No windows came down. No movement of any kind. Her friend was pressed to the ground beside the tent, breathing fast and shallow. They waited. They kept waiting. Expecting a door to open at any moment. The doors never opened. Eventually, without warning or explanation, the engine turned on again. The truck reversed slowly and carefully back down the narrow spur road. Still no headlights. It disappeared back into the trees exactly as it had come. Her friend burst through the tent entrance, shaking. Everyone gathered, whispering. Their snoring friend slept through the entire thing. They barely slept after that. At first light, they packed up and hiked out immediately. At the ranger station, they asked casually whether anyone had checked on their site overnight. The answer was no. And then the ranger added, without being prompted, they don't have any unmarked black trucks. She says she knows one thing for certain. Whoever was driving that truck was not lost. And she is deeply, profoundly grateful that whatever they had intended, they chose not to act on it that night. Story 9, The Lost Hours on the Superior Trail. This next story is different from the others. There is no lurking figure here, no unexpected sound in the night. This story is quieter and in some ways stranger, because what happened has no explanation that holds up under any logical scrutiny. Our storyteller and his brother decided to do a long-day hike on the Superior Hiking Trail, starting north of Two Harbors. The previous night had felt vaguely off, a late grocery run to Duluth, motel that felt seedier than expected, the general feeling of something not quite right that they chalked up to travel fatigue and let go of. They hit the trail early, around 8 in the morning, planning 4 hours out and 4 hours back, reaching the car before dark. For anyone unfamiliar with the Superior Hiking Trail, it is rugged, exposed, steep in places, with rocky patches and stretches that feel genuinely wild despite being a marked and maintained trail. Not something you want to be navigating after the sun goes down. The first half was wonderful. They talked openly about life. He had been going through a difficult stretch personally, and even with the challenging terrain, they handled it comfortably. They reached a point near Lutsen Lodge and turned around. And that is when things quietly, inexplicably changed. Their pace slowed. Not intentionally, they simply felt heavier, as though the air itself had thickened around them. Their legs did not feel exhausted, but their speed had dropped noticeably. And the trail around them began to feel subtly, indefinably off. They did not pass a single person on the return journey. Not one of the several groups they had seen on the way out. Not the college students who had been somewhere ahead of them. Nobody. At one point, they noticed clusters of mushrooms that neither of them recognized and which, when checked later online, turned out not to be native to that part of Minnesota at all. When they reached a familiar clearing where they had previously stopped to check their progress, his brother looked at his phone and frowned. He asked what time they thought it was. Based on the distance covered and the slower pace they had been moving at, the answer seemed obvious: around 4 in the afternoon. They needed to move faster. It was just after 1 in the afternoon. They had covered, in 1 hour, a distance that had taken them 2 hours on the way out, despite walking significantly more slowly the entire time. The math did not work. The physics did not work. No explanation they attempted, adjusting for rest breaks, considering the terrain differences, accounting for any variable they could think of, brought them to a conclusion that made sense. They walked out of the forest nearly 2 hours ahead of schedule. They should have arrived at the trailhead at dusk. They arrived in broad, full daylight. The entire return felt like moving through a quiet, autumn-colored pocket of unreality. Normal on the surface. But not right in any way that could be precisely identified or measured. He says this is the short version of a much longer and stranger story. And he wants to be clear, his timekeeping was not faulty. The distance was abnormal. The physics were impossible. And it has made him genuinely uncomfortable ever since. If anyone has any explanation, any at all, he says he would be grateful to hear it. Story 10, The Primal Instinct. Our final story tonight is the shortest, but in its own quiet way, perhaps the most honest of all. Our storyteller was camping at a national park with 2 friends. One of those straightforward campgrounds with a picnic table and a fire ring. Ordinary, familiar, comfortable. In the middle of the night, he woke up needing to use the bathroom. He went, took care of it, and was walking back to the tent when he stopped to look at the stars and light a cigarette. He stood there, calm and relaxed, 1 or 2 minutes at most. And then a wave moved through him. He described it as primal instinct, something beneath thought, beneath language. His adrenaline sharpened. His senses widened. Nothing around him had changed. There was no sound, no movement, no visible cause for alarm. But he knew. His body simply knew, something is here, and it is watching you. He finished his cigarette calmly. Walked back to the tent without rushing, without any sudden movements. Got inside. Listened. Nothing came. He told himself he had spooked himself and went back to sleep. In the morning, their campsite had been thoroughly ransacked. An animal had passed through in the night, searching for food, tearing apart anything within reach. His friend's old baseball hat, worn all summer, soaked in human scent, had been shredded completely. Pieces of it scattered all over the campsite. The tent had not been touched. He says he knows now, with certainty, to listen to his gut. Because whatever had come through that campsite in the dark, it had been there, right beside him, watching him stand under the stars. And something in him had known before his eyes or ears could tell him a single thing. And that, dear friends, brings us to the end of tonight's collection. Thank you so much for spending this evening with us. These stories were shared by real people who lived through real moments, moments of fear, of wonder, of instinct, of the inexplicable. And I think there is something deeply valuable in sitting with them together. If you enjoyed tonight's stories, please do give this video a thumbs up, it means more than you know and helps us reach more listeners who would love to be part of this community. And if you have a story of your own, something that happened in the woods, on a trail, at a campsite, something you have never been able to fully explain, please share it in the comments. I read every single one. What do you think really happened in these stories? Which one stayed with you the most? Write your thoughts below and let's talk about it together. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new video, because tomorrow night, we continue our nature series with cabin stories. And if these camping tales gave you chills, you will not want to miss what comes next. Until then, stay safe out there. Trust your instincts. And if something in the dark feels wrong, listen to it. Good night, everyone. Sleep well.